Hello and welcome to Tom Talks. Today we're going to be looking at the front wing and some of its flow interactions. Now I should mention that there is some inspiration for this video and it comes from the Formula One media, and what we normally hear is something that goes like this. Well, the teams are working to better manage the airflow in this region so they can tidy up the turbulent weight behind the front tyre and therefore extract more downforce downstream. Now, this is a statement which gets put absolutely everywhere for every single part of the car, whether it's rear tyre, front tyre, halo, anything. It's all about manipulating the airflow to control wakes. What does this mean? So today I'm actually going to show you. I've prepared some geometry to set up some very specific interactions so we can go through some of the fundamentals about flow interaction. And in this case it's the front wing footplate vortex and how that merges or works with the front tyre. So I'm really looking forward to presenting this one, and I think that you should be looking forward to seeing it. Okay, so first I'll show you the geometry that we're going to be using. Now, it looks simple, but you'd be amazed at how many changes in flow features you get just from a simple change. So in this case, we've got ourselves a triple element wing. This is based off the 2009 Formula One regulations, but I've heavily modified it so that I can show you the interactions that I want to show you. I just used it off some regulations so that you have some rough scale in there. Now, the difference between the left-hand and right-hand side is that the right-hand side is a larger span. The left-hand side is a shorter span. And I've done this for a specific reason, you might know why, but basically, very common. If we push up air in front of the tyre or do more in front of the tyre, we typically have better tyre wake management. And this isn't always the case, and I'm going to illustrate that quite nicely. So I'll show you the geometry just a little bit there. And we're not really going to be focusing on the Y250 part of it. The wings are identical except for that footplate height, and trust me, you'll be amazed at how much changes. Okay, so firstly we'll sweep through in our X direction, which is going with the flow on our CPO or our CPT or our loss contour or our energy of air contour, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so starting at the front here, this is our low span. I'm just going to provide some brief commentary. So we're going near our throat, we roll up our outer footplate vortex, we have that spillover coming. We've got some losses quite substantially off the trailing element, off the trailing edge, sorry, of the main element, and on the secondary, and all up in this corner. Most F1 teams will fillet this region, but obviously we're not dealing with an optimized geometry. We're encountering some separation there. We're quite heavily in ground effect. You can see how close everything is to the ground, especially the footplate. Nevertheless, let's continue on. Okay, so we've got some separation right there near the back of the end plate, and this flow is really starting to kick in quite a lot towards the footplate there. As you can see, rolling up quite a vortex in here. And we'll continue through. Now, a lot of separation off the end plate here. This is quite obvious because the end plate geometry is straight. So if I bring up the model, you can see that the end plate is straight. Now, this is not ideal in this case because behind the front wing we've got a wake that we want to fill, so the airflow is going to be coming and wanting to fill that void behind, and so we're getting some separations off the end plate. In this case, you definitely want to run an in-washing style end plate to reduce those losses off the end plate itself. For this, I don't really mind. In fact, I want it to create a little bit of loss, so I can use it as an example, but you'd want an in-washing profile. Something I should note is just because a profile is in-washing or out-washing doesn't necessarily mean that it's in-washing or out-washing. You can have an in-washing profile which is still naturally trying to get the air to outwash. It's all based on the relative flow vector and what the air wants to do at that specific spot. Okay, so back to our CFD, we'll continue on. So now we've got this quite defined two structures, obviously the Y250 here, which we'll ignore because we're not really focusing on the inboard section, although it does have large viscosity effects, which we can't completely neglect, even though we're trying to isolate this system here. Now we've got this other vortex structure, oops, we've got this other structure which is continuing to roll up, and as we continue, it's sort of broken up there into another top structure, quite a bit weaker obviously, and if we keep playing, we've got some squirt coming out now through our tyre, and quite a lot of loss, and this structure ends up sort of around here. Okay, that's a very brief overview of our short span geometry. Now we'll go through our larger span geometry. I've labelled everything at the top in case you'd like to see at the start of each sweep. Okay, so let's go again. Okay, so this time we're still rolling up a similar vortex structure. Now you can see that we've got a lot more separation already in this corner here, and that's likely due to what outlet condition that we're giving this section of the wing, but this is a general overview. I'll have side-by-sides after. Now you can see we're rolling up a vortex structure, and you can see it's gotten very, very big very, very quickly. So our loss has gotten absolutely massive, which is probably explaining some of the separation that we saw in that edge. And if we continue, this is coming inboard of the wheel. Looks like it creates two loss structures like before. We don't really know their relative strengths though, compared to before. And we'll keep going. And it's on top of the tyre squirt like before, and we end up with a wake behind the tyre, which looks something like that. So on the premise, it might not seem like too much has changed, but once we compare, you can really see. It's very important that I give you a general overview of what the flow looks like, and then we can go into more detail. Okay, so this is around the second element, just after the main plane, and we can compare. So obviously we're on the larger span, lower span. So lower span now, larger span, lower span. And the first thing that we notice is the footplate vortex. Now on the lower span, we've got this loss peeling in and over and quite a tight little core there. In the other, it's already beginning to get really quite lossy, as you can see. Now if I come back, we can also see some separations behind the wing and in this gap, as I mentioned before. Nothing's optimized geometry, everything's first go, best go, but we can do our best, and it's not too bad that we're introducing some losses here. I mean, it is terrible for design, but for the purposes of demonstration, I think we're okay. So you can see here, now typically with this loss, it's larger, and you can see it's affecting slightly bigger area here. So if I flip through, affecting a bigger area, and this is, you're getting a bit of element support from it. So you can look at the loss here, and we've gained a little bit of element support there. The profiles are the exact same, the height above ground is the exact same, so we've gained some element support. Now another thing that you can notice is what it's doing to the ground plane. So in our first case here, we've got quite a lot of pickup here off the ground plane, and in our other case, a bit less pickup. So we're already beginning to work out what our angular velocities are looking like at these points. Now, ground plane pickup, it's important that you obviously simulate it correctly. You place inflation over your ground plane, which I have done. The ground plane will develop a boundary layer, which is commonly forgotten because the front wing is accelerating airflow underneath it, and we're dealing with a triple element wing. It's not the most aggressive wing in the world, it's still somewhat conservative, but it is very close to the ground at this point, so we're going to get quite a bit of localized acceleration underneath that wing, lots of localized acceleration, and then a thicker boundary layer on the ground, and you can sort of pick it up a bit with this vortex. Now, that's getting into the really nitty-gritty, and designing with that and accounting for things like roughness, surface roughnesses, and measuring what tracks are like is a whole other level. I'd like to know what Formula 1 teams do, but I've got no idea, I'll be honest. Okay, let's go down a little bit further. Okay, so now we're approaching the back side of the front wing end plate. So here's our low span, here's our large span. So low span, large span, low span, large span. First thing that we notice is the vortex. Let me just blow it up for you. That was so bad. Okay, so yes, this vortex has really blown up quite massively. We've gained quite a lot of loss here. The front wing expanding in that region isn't helping it. It's just bringing it up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And we're getting some vortex decay or burst or whatever you want to call it. We can confirm this with other contours as well, but typically what I've found is the most effective is using the contours that show the maximum difference between your iterations. So I'm going to show you some really neat contours to look at your vortex burst. Okay, so you can also see that we've got massive loss off the end plate. This is, like I mentioned before, because we've got a straight end plate. Just because it's straight doesn't mean that it's not trying to outwash. This end plate right now is really trying to outwash, and we're getting massive separation off it because the air wants to inwash. So it's all relative to what the flow is doing in that specific spot. Okay, let's move on a bit further. So this is the front wheel, just coming into view here. This is our low span, and that's our large span. Low span, large span. Low span, large span. Now generally our large span looks similar to our low span. So you can kind of see we've got these two well-defined structures, one here and similar here. Now this one, albeit, is spread out quite a bit more, but relatively speaking, they're similar structures. We do have a bit more ground plane loss there, but I mean, nothing major. Because of the geometry, we're not putting many structures into the front tire, into the contact patch in this particular geometry, so we're pretty similar there as well. Now these structures look quite similar. Before, they didn't look very similar at all. So now's the time when I'd look at another plot to begin to see what's actually going on in this region. So my next default is coefficient of pressure. We'll start at the throat really quickly. So quite similar between our low span, large span, low span, large span. You can see our vortex cores beginning to form in those regions. So we can really track those as we go. Now this is our low span. Wow, we've really got quite a big core here, almost comparable to the Y250, which is quite interesting. Now we'll go to our large span. Well that's interesting. Our large span has significantly dropped off its vortex. Even though it's a larger span wing. Larger span wing, greater efficiency. We should really be rolling up a more powerful vortex. So this is indicative that we were accurate when we're looking at our CPT and seeing the massive loss, that we're probably experiencing a bit of a blow up. Okay, so let's keep going. So here's our low span as we're coming just close to the presence of the front wheel, and our large span. Okay, that's a huge difference. You don't even need a difference plot to see that. Low span, large span, we have completely lost our front wing footplate vortex there, which in this case, with a wing that is ever so narrow, is quite important to manage the front squirt, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Now, I've seen from the 2008 regulations, there's a Honda paper out there online somewhere, and it details a bit more the merging of the front wing footplate vortex using the strakes with the tyre squirt. So we've already seen some quite large differences. Let's see how it actually affects the tyre squirt. Okay, now so here's our low span and here's our high span. Or large span, sorry. Low span, large span, low span. Okay, so we can see that here's our structure. It's quite high off the ground. And let's look at our new one. You can see how it's been drawn in a lot, really quite a lot into here. So it's nowhere near as strong, which is what we'd expect from what we've seen already. Now let's see what this means when we actually begin to look at the wakes. So you can see here versus here. So our low span is, for wake management, actually a favorable concept in this regard. It's quite clear to see we've retained some of the wake and we've got less loss inboard, which is quite important, because if you've got, say, a floor near this region or quite a low coefficient of pressure area, it's going to want to suck any loss that it can into this area. So keeping the energy of the air in this section nice and high, not having the losses spilling out from our tyre jet, is really quite important. Why the hell is it happening? Because as most of us think, if we put wings in front of a wheel, we're typically doing good. Now, like I said, you have to compare what the differences are, and the difference here, we're looking at the footplate vortex. That's the thing that's burst. What's different about the footplate? Well, it's the same height above the ground, it's the same diameter. The wing profiles and outboard geometry is the same, albeit there's some, so the span differences are changing roughly your coefficient of pressure underneath the wing, which will affect your inwash. But the big one is, where do you string it up? Where do you begin to make your vortex? And in the case of the large span, we make the vortex directly in front of the wheel, in about the midpoint of the wheel near the contact patch. The lower span is much more to the inboard side. So our outlet condition has effectively changed massively. We've put a wall right behind our vortex, and this has decreased our ability to retain it for longer. And there's a very, very neat plot that we can use, or contour rather, that we can use to see this happening, which I'll show you in a bit. Now, let's just say that we're going to keep the same span wing, so we want to string up the vortex in the same spot because we're too worried about front end balance. How could we fix this? So I've gone and prepared another geometry, and this one is really quite cool as well. So it looks something like this. We can see we have our large span wing, this time on the right hand side, and our lower span wing on the left hand side. Now the inboard sections are the exact same, but you can see the outboard section of the new one is very, very different. Now what I've done is I've raised up the outer section elements there, and I've also backed them off. I've reduced their chord length, I've changed their angle of attack slightly so they're a bit lower. The footplate geometry, sorry, the footplate position is the exact same as before, but I've added also a little extension there. So a few simple changes, but let's see how this affects the tyre squirt in this particular simulation. Now, let's do it. This is going to be quite cool. Okay, so here's our large span, and here's our updated geometry. Large span, updated geometry. First thing that we notice is the relative vortex size. So we've got this extra plate here. This is making the flow pass through quite a small area, and this can tend to laterally shift your vortex a little bit more inboard because it's running closer to the ground. You can sometimes get a little bit more local load from it though. It's a big trade-off and a good tuning tool. Let's have a bit more of a look into actually what the vortex looks like. So at the beginning, relatively similar. Now, the other thing to notice is the outboard section of the wing. So if I come back to our large span, we've got this separation in there, and our new geometry, nowhere near as much separation. In fact, it's rather clean. This is because the outboard section is high off the ground, we're less in ground effect, so we're not pushing the surfaces as hard, reduce chord, and reduce effective angle of attack as well. So all very cool so far. The thing that you gotta take into account and remember is in our new geometry here, you have all of this clean mass flow. Gorgeous clean mass flow that you're feeding the vortex. So we're going to try to prevent it from bursting by backing off our wings and feeding it with very, very clean air. Another way that you could do this is perhaps open up an outlet on the outside of your end plate and stuff clean air in there, which I'm sure you've seen on race cars before. Alright, let's keep moving down. So here's our large span, and here's our updated geometry. Large span, updated geometry, large span. And you can see, as we saw before, we have that huge blow up. Now with our updated geometry, it's significantly more clean. I didn't change the end plate, so we're getting this real separation there. I didn't change it because I wanted to change as few things as possible between the two cases, so I can show you how simple geometrical changes makes a big difference. So I've left that there, but you can see the vortex is now not blowing up anywhere near as much. It's laterally moved inboard quite a lot, even though the outboard section of the wing is not as aggressive. Typically, when we make an outboard section of the wing quite aggressive, we roll up a lot of flow in-washing in under, although the opposite can also be true. When you back off the outboards or increase the angle of attack of the outboard section, you can laterally expand air from the center line of the car outboard. So there are two ways to look at it. In this case, I think we're getting a lot of lateral movement in because we have pushed the air through such a small gap between that footplate extension, and it's moved inboard quite a lot. Now let's get near the tire. So here was our original geometry. You can see it's really spread out over quite a big area. It's very lossy. It's not got a lot of energy. Let's have a look at our new one. Wow, okay, so we've got this much tighter vortex core here, and it's traveling much stronger. We've cleaned up a lot of the loss in that area. Let's see how that affects our tire squirt. Okay, so coming just after the contact patch of the tire now, this is what our original squirt looks like, and here's our updated. So you can see down the bottom there, we've taken some of that squirt, it's been pushed down, and it's also moved in quite a bit as well. And we've got a lot cleaner air, and we'll go just a bit further back, so towards the end of the tire, we've got even bigger differences. Very simple geometrical changes, and we've just stopped that front wing footplate vortex bursting. The tricky part is managing this vortex over a bunch of different conditions. Different yaws are going to inwash different amounts underneath the front wing. Different rolls are going to set the footplate height differently. There are so many different factors to go into here. How close is your proximity to a wall? How does that affect your inwash through this region? There is a bunch of different stuff. Has your contact patch changed size? So it feels like an appropriate time to mention the CFD setup. I originally ran a lot of these cases with 20 million cells, but I actually changed to 10 million because I wanted to do more simulations on different types of geometry. I'm not made of computing power, so I'm limited in that regard, but I still feel that for the interactions that we're looking for and the quite significant changes that we're going after, it's a fairly accurate representation for us to compare basic trends. Now, in the real world, F1 teams are, I don't know how, but they are producing different models for their contact patch in multiple different conditions. So when you're cornering, contact patch is changing. This is a massive resource on the teams and can be one of the key performance differentiators, as James Allison actually said, between the top and bottom teams. And this is why moving forward we've got bigger wheels, or part of the reason why moving forward we've got bigger wheels, smaller sidewall, less ballooning, less deformation, easier for the teams to work around. I promised that there was a contour that I could use to show you some of the differences between a vortex bursting and not. So the ones that I've found more success with is, as I mentioned before, using contours or plots or whatever to show the biggest difference between two flow fields. So you've got your CPO or your CPT or loss or whatever, and you can see the blow up there. You've got your CP or your coefficient of pressure, and you can quite easily see the vortex core there because it's related largely to how fast the air is moving. And then very highly underestimated, I think, is velocity. And when I say look at a contour of velocity, I don't mean velocity magnitude. I mean velocity in relation to your stream. So in this case, our air is going through on the x-axis. So you can plot velocity in the x-axis and you'll get a really good understanding of how fast the vortex core is moving into the page. So let me show you. Now, this is our large span geometry with our x velocity. We've got a huge hole in this region. Huge hole there. So we've got really not a lot of velocity coming out of the page into us in this case. But with all the changes that we made in the updated geometry, big difference. So this is exactly what you're trying to look for. You're trying to look for the contours so that you can see the absolute maximum difference between two runs, and then you can decipher what you've actually done and how you've made it better. So in this case, yes, we've got this huge loss off the end plate, which is easily fixable in one iteration, and we're beginning to get some deceleration in the core, so this is absolutely not perfect. You could iterate this so much more, but generally speaking, you are traveling significantly better in that region, and that is why our squirt differences look like that. Alright, so that concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm glad that you got through there because there's a lot of CFD and a lot of things I mentioned. I went on a lot of different tangents, but I think that's the great part of it. Now, I should mention, I've actually just realized that I forgot to say how the footplate vortex is actually managing the squirt. And I don't really want to explain it here. I'd prefer to do it with CFD, so I suppose I'll do another video on the front wing interactions. And I look forward to seeing you there. Oh, one more thing, if you thought that I got something wrong, or there's a contour or a way that you like to interpret the CFD in a more effective way, I'd love to have a discussion with you and learn a bit. So yeah, definitely let me know. I'll see you on the next video.